Labour will end the VAT exemption for private schools to invest in our state schools. So said the Labour Party election manifesto in 2024. And in the budget later that year, the addition of VAT to school fees was enacted. This was soon followed by predictions of a dramatic fall in the number of pupils attending independent schools, with some claiming that we would see a 25% drop as a result of this policy. In June 2026, the Department for Education's official data showed that the drop in pupil numbers in independent schools since 2024 was in fact 5.6%. In this episode, I am joined by two people who have never been fans of this controversial policy. What do they make of the 5.6% decrease in independent school pupils since 2024? Is VAT the only reason why pupil numbers are falling? And how has the politics of VAT on school fees changed since this policy was introduced? My guests are Julie Robinson, CEO at the Independent Schools Council, an umbrella body for 1,400 schools, and Maxwell Marlowe, the Head of Public Affairs at the Adam Smith Institute. I'm Tom Richmond, and to find out if the debate over VAT on school fees is over or just getting started, let's go inside your ed.
Welcome to Inside Your Ed, the podcast that looks inside the latest stories from across the education system in England, including primary and secondary schools, colleges, universities, and apprenticeships. You can listen to all our past episodes, subscribe to future episodes, and get in touch by visiting insideyoured.com.
VAT on independent school fees has rarely been out of the headlines over the past couple of years, but given all the noise that this policy has generated, it's easy to forget why this whole debate kicked off in the first place. So, Julie, let's quickly remind listeners of some of the background here. Why did the government say they were removing the VAT exemption on independent school fees? When did this change actually take effect? And how much money does the government think they can raise from this policy?
The timing was a shocker. So it was on the 29th of July 2024 when the government announced that as of the 1st of January 2025, just a few months later, all education, boarding and vocational training provided for a charge by an independent school in the UK would be subject to VAT at the standard rate of 20%. Now, this was a huge shock because the timescale was very short for a major VAT change. And it caused issues for school finance managers working through long lists of queries about what was and was not chargeable. And the short timescale also meant enormous pressure on families who couldn't afford a fees hike of 1/5 just like that. And it caused some of them to move their children mid-school year. Now, we'd hoped that the tax changes would be phased in over time, so it wouldn't have caused so much distress to families and pressures on schools. And there was an expectation just prior to the announcement that the changes would effectively start at the beginning of an academic year, so September 2025. So instead, we found ourselves with the top rate straight away. Now, the reason for this was the government said they expected to raise £1.7 billion per year by 2029. At the time, an IFS report said that the effect on the level of independent schooling from imposing VAT on fees was uncertain, and the evidence on changes, behavioural changes, was quite thin. Another thing to know about predictions was that the government predicted that beyond 2030, there would be 37,000 fewer pupils in the independent sector of education in the UK as a result of this measure. By 2026 now, over the last 2 years, pupil numbers have already fallen by 33,231.
Okay, so the government announced it in 2024. This policy came into effect in January 2025. So we've had about 18 months of this policy now in place. All of which brings us on to the question of the effect that this policy has had on independent schools. Maxwell, you were so interested in the effects of VAT on school fees that you made a public bet with Sam Friedman, a writer and commentator on politics and education, about what the impact of this policy would be. So, tell us about the bet and tell us what happened.
Sure. So the reason I did the bet is because it takes a bit of inspiration from my dear friend, Dr. Christopher Snowdon at the Institute for Economic Affairs, who once made a public bet with another academic on the rate of child poverty. And Chris had made the bets and said, oh, well, I don't think it's going to go up in the next 5 years. We can return to this. And the other guy just said, no, it will absolutely skyrocket. He ended up winning. So I just thought a bit of inspiration for that. It's also the case it's quite dry and quite nerdy. Looking back on it, I wouldn't do it again. I think it was a little bit crass. But, somewhat fate has landed it on my doorstep. I did lose the bet overall. But the reason I did it fundamentally is to make sure people can get an understanding of what's at risk here. Because the IFS, the government, and Sam Friedman and other people who are in favour of this tax move seem to be minimising the potential harms that are caused from quite distortive taxes. Value-added tax, VAT, is the least distortive tax possible. But when you're placing it on a sector which is already quite fragile in terms of its competition and prices, you end up with quite a damaging tax. And it's been clear from the rhetoric from the people that were pushing it and the current Secretary of State, Bridget Phillipson, that this is about fundamentally punishing private schools. The tax is all about removing the ability of private schools to operate. Part of the bet was saying, actually, this is going to get much worse than you think it will. And I think the data really does show that. So you can look at, what Julia said here about, the 33,000 students that have left the independent sector. But if you look at the mainstream private school sector, those numbers are much higher if you include Scotland. So it's about 45,000 students have left mainstream independent schools. The bet, was made on the overall figures. So that's why I lost, the bet was, at 5%. Which is the kind of Sam Friedman's point of view. I would give his charity of choice £100. If it's less than 5%, it's £250. At 7%, it's break even. About 10%, it's that's where I would win the bet again. That's where I thought we would be by this point in time. And at 15%, it's £250 my way. So you can think of it as sort of a V on a graph. So overall, with the bet, I lost. If we only looked at mainstream independent schools, though, I'd have won. So really, it's all about how one defines what that exodus looks like and where those students are going.
Well done for publicly accepting that you did lose the bet that you made with Sam on this occasion. But I think it is worth probing this bet a little further because it was all about your respective predictions. But as Julie has just described, in the grand scheme of things, this is quite a new policy. And the 5.6% reduction that we've seen in independent school pupil numbers has taken place over just 2 years. So Maxwell, to what extent do you think the impact of VAT on school fees is likely to be a one-off short-term shock to independent school numbers, as your bet with Sam seemed to suggest? Or do you think there are reasons to believe that this impact could in fact be felt into 2026 and beyond?
So I think it's a confluence of three factors. So the first is the resilience of the sector, and a lot of the schools previously that were closed, in the immediate aftermath of the imposition of VAT were struggling already. We have serious demographic pressures, which I think is well acknowledged amongst the education sector, but also those of us who are economists can also point to that quite clearly. But, as your own research has pointed out, Tom, the larger schools are now starting to feel that hit. And that's because there are other pressures within the economy. There's increases in national insurance. There's increases on business rates. The additional confluence of this is the removal of charitable relief for business rates as well. So I think this is going to be long running fundamentally. So taking into account the dire economic performance the UK finds itself in with shrinking disposable income until 2029, 2030, included on that, of course, the continuation of lower demographics, we're going to see many more schools close. And I think it's going to be in the independent sector because that's where the cost is felt. Parents don't have to send their children to what I would consider to be quite expensive education overall. I know there's a large difference in between both ends of the scale here. But they don't have to make these costs, and many parents can't afford to send their kids to school when they can't pay the mortgage or they can't pay their energy or their water bills. So this is the thing, which is that I think this is, if as long as economic pressure continues, the impact of the tax will continue to degrade the size of the sector overall. So I think just to really hammer down on one point, though, is that the government essentially set themselves a budget for how many students are going to leave when they did their initial impact assessment. They've already made up about 70 to 80% of that budget, and the tax has only been in for, 18 months? We've got another few years to go before that budget of how many students can leave the sector until it starts losing money kicks in. And let's not forget, the £1.8 billion by 2029 is a gross figure. It doesn't include other costs for where students move into the state sector and therefore cost the government much more. Or if they get EHCP plans funded by local authorities, where they cost a heck of a lot more, up to £40,000 to £50,000. So, I stand by my point. I think this is going to lose money by the end of the fiscal period.
Julie, as someone who leads a representative body for independent schools, what are you hearing from your members about when the impact of VAT on school fees is likely to have bitten? Was this all just a nasty blip from 2025 to 2026 and things should be a lot calmer from this point forward?
Well, I think will become clearer over several years. So we were always expecting this to play out over various years. So we know that intake years have seen a deeper like-for-like decrease in pupil numbers. That's going to work its way through. We know that parents tend to do all they possibly can to see their children through to the end of a phase, so a transition point where they move on to perhaps a senior school from a junior school. So we are expecting to see it play out over time. We need to track those trends really carefully, not just make assumptions about it. But also we should remember that the sector will adapt. We are seeing lots of mergers and groupings of schools. So it's really helpful to follow the number of pupils in the sector rather than purely the number of schools. So our census in 2026, we represent 85% of all pupils in independent schools across the UK. And we do a census each year. We've done that census since 1974. So this year's census shows a decrease of 19,029 pupils, which is 3.5% compared with the numbers in 2025, and then steeper decreases in entry years. The DfE's number also show that pupil numbers decreased more than the demographic decline. So we know the birth rate is going down. We know that there's been much more of a decline in independent schools than in schools overall. And as Maxwell said, we've seen a net loss of mainstream independent schools. So we've lost 64 mainstream independent schools. And that means, I know Max was saying, it's a bit dry and nerdy, but then you qualified that with, we've got to think about what's at risk here. This is pupils and families. This is staff losing their jobs, support staff and teachers, and wider knock-on effects across communities, particularly in rural areas, because independent schools aren't spread evenly across the country. So we are seeing patchy effects. We know independent schools are resilient. They have been in the past. We've got confidence in a strong future, but right now it's a really tough time. There are various financial pressures on schools, lots of economic pressures, loss of business rates relief to those schools who are run by charities. They've had a lot to deal with, really going back to Brexit and then COVID and onwards. So it's really, really tough times. In summary, we've never seen a drop as big as this. Children are at the heart of this. Children have had to move schools. Children have had to move from friendship groups, families moving house for schools. It's really unfortunate that the policy is having those effects with very little discernible improvement to the state sector as a result. So tough times in our sector. That's what we're seeing.
Okay, so it sounds like both of you were still expecting independent schools to come under more strain in future. But that brings us to one of what I think is the trickiest issues in this whole debate, which is how much of this strain that independent schools are facing is in fact due to the VAT on school fees. As you just mentioned, Judy, there are lots of other factors that seem to be relevant here. The removal of charitable business rates relief for independent schools. We've had a big rise also in employers' national insurance contributions, which affects independent schools. We've had big rises in the national minimum wage. And yes, we have also seen a wider demographic fall. So state school pupil numbers have fallen by about 1.6% over the past 2 years. That's much smaller than the 5.6% drop in independent school numbers, but it does go to show there are wider factors at play in that regard. Julie, this 4% gap between the reduction in independent and state school pupil numbers could have been caused by VAT on school fees, but with so many other factors in the mix, how confident are you that it is VAT specifically that's causing independent schools to struggle at the moment?
This emerging trend is steeper than anything else in the last decade, including during COVID. It's difficult to say for certain exactly how much of the effect is VAT alone, but certainly schools in difficulty and parents have said that's what was a bridge too far for them. We've had recessions before, we've had birth rate shifts before, we've had tax changes before, but we've not had a drop in numbers like this before.
Maxwell, what's your take on this? Independent schools have clearly been hit with several policy changes since the last general election. So where do you think VAT fits into all this?
As I said earlier, it is a confluence of multiple things. And I'd say VAT is the largest hammer to hit the independent sector. And I think that's clear if you speak to treasurers, if you speak to CFOs of schools, they're very clear that this is what's happened. Again, if you look at the people who are having to pay these bills to Inland Revenue or HMT or however you want to phrase it, that they're coming away and that's their experience. It's their lived experience. So I'd say it's significant, but I would also acknowledge, you can't ignore the fact that independent education is incredibly human capital intensive. It is one of the defining marks of Britain's high quality of independent school education. There's a reason why many people send their children to British schools. It's not just the manner in which they are taught or the facilities at which they're taught at. It's also the number of teachers, the ratio between student and teacher, which is really important. And if that ratio is very low, as it is in the independent sector, that means you need more staff. And that means you pay more on your national insurance bill if you're an employer. And it's also the case that because of the quality of these teachers, they command a higher salary. And that means that they are, exempt fundamentally from what that lower marginal cost is. So it is a mix of very poor economic conditions. And I come back to my overall point, which is that the sector is really at the sharp end of a lot of poor macroeconomic performance across the British economy. The reason British households are struggling is because they can't afford things that aren't critical to the existence of that household, of which, unfortunately, independent education for most people isn't one of them. So I'd really be cautious by overstating the point for VAT. It is the largest hammer, as I've said. But it's not the only hammer, and it is really an indictment on our economic system of governance as to why the economy as a whole, but particularly the independent school sector, and we can also make the same point on hospitality, for example, which again is human capital intensive, as to why they're really suffering. But I'd say independent schools were pointed out for ideological reasons rather than fiscal reasons.
So you're absolutely right. We know schools spend a huge proportion of their budget on staffing. But I know there are great teachers in all kinds of schools. So I've seen it from both sides, and there are some fantastic teachers.
Well, seeing as you raised state school teachers, Julie, let's turn now to what happened to the money that the VAT on school fees has supposedly raised. Julie, we had in the Labour Party manifesto in 2024, if you look at the costings that they did, the money that was raised from VAT on school fees had a great big list of things attached to it in terms of what the government's going to spend it on. But number one on that list was 6,500 new teachers. Julie, what's happened to that commitment over the past couple of years?
I think what we're saying in the course of our discussion today is it's just not clear that this policy is raising the money it was forecast to raise. We're seeing the government is actually suggesting more money is being raised than forecast. But as you referred to earlier, in Scotland, there's economic analysis suggesting that VAT is resulting in a net loss. So we'd very much like to see a review of the net fiscal impact of the policy on the country's finances overall. It's for the government to decide how they apportion it, but I'd question that we are seeing any positive result across the education system from that policy.
Well, just to emphasise the point, 6,500 new teachers was one of the government's most high-profile commitments in its Labour manifesto the last election. But rather unexpectedly, last year, on the 11th of June, so almost exactly a year after we're recording this episode, Prime Minister Keir Starmer said the following on Twitter. In the budget last year, my government made the tough but fair decision to apply VAT to private schools. The Tories opposed it, Reform opposed it. Today, because of that choice, we have announced the largest investment in affordable housing in a generation. So even with the money that's coming in, it does seem like there is some debate even within government about exactly what's happening to that money. That does appear to have changed over time. Maxwell, does it matter much for this VAT policy on school fees if the money gets spent somewhere other than education, or is that not really central to the debate, do you think?
I think it's central to the political debate, certainly. I don't think it's not crucial to the policy that the money is allocated to teachers. I mean, when you look at how government finances function, it just goes into a big pot, fundamentally. We can go into how money flows through the system. Government just, deletes numbers on one spreadsheet and adds them to the other. It's an accounting exercise, fundamentally. The point is, though, is that when we look at the actual statistics the government released on its 6,500 pledge, we know that the number of full-time equivalent teachers is down by 1,900 since 2024. We know that the overall workforce in education is down by 1,500 and secondary teachers fell by 500. So we know that, that they're failing on this commitment. It's also the case that a lot of people during the debates were saying, oh, well, private school teachers will move to state schools. There's no evidence of that. I'd like to see some if it's the case. I think, as Julie's rightly highlighted, there are incredibly high quality teachers in both sectors. And it's good that they can be shared on both sides. But there was a National Education Union survey which said that 1 in 5 private school teachers reported redundancies at their schools, 26% reported recruitment freezes, redundancy and restructuring casework ran at roughly double in 2025 compared to the earlier year. So we can see this has been very damaging for employment, and it's, again, unsurprising given where the education sector is. But this is the overall thing, I think, is as soon as the tax really came in, the VAT came in, the government just started dropping new commitments of what it's doing with the money. One moment it's doing affordable housing, the next moment it's doing tooth cleaning lessons for primary school children, the next it's doing free breakfast clubs and whatever else. They've really lost control over the narrative here because they know they can't meet those obligations. It reminds me very much, actually, of poor Angela Rayner, who was foisted upon her the 1.5 million new homes target. Very unhappy about that, I'll tell you that much. When I speak to my friends in government, she was very unhappy about it. And Bridget Phillipson sort of inherited this and turned around and went, one moment, we can't meet this. What I found very interesting watching the World Cup, Tom, is I was watching on ITV the fantastic Iran game the other day against Belgium. And what happened during the hydration break but an advert from the Department for Education to hire new teachers. The government is really struggling with this at the moment. And if you're spending the money, a lot of money, to advertise during prime-time World Cup games that you need new teachers, I think you've given the game up quite a bit.
Well, you mentioned the politics of VAT on school fees, Maxwell. As it stands today, how would you describe the political element of this debate, particularly with what look like quite clear fault lines now visible between many of the major political parties?
We know that Reform have said that they're going to remove the VAT. We know that the Tories have. We know that a lot of Liberal Democrats have said this is a bad thing. Again, it comes back to the fundamental point on this, which is it's targeted class warfare, fundamentally, right? We know this is the case. We've seen that Bridget Phillipson, for example, has stood up and campaigned with the 93% Club. Now, look, people should have pride in where they go to school. I don't really think it matters. And yes, there have been problems in the perceptions of the elite private schools, certainly. Don't get me wrong. I didn't go to a fantastically posh school up in Staffordshire. I went to quite a normal independent school, if one can define it. But what I found completely remarkable in this whole saga, this very sorry saga, is the politics of envy, fundamentally. I know it sounds like a bit of a conservative talking point, and I am an economist on the right after all. But this is what I have seen, is that, politicians have framed this tax as basically doing one over Eton. In fact, we saw this with a lot of the debates that was going on. When they were considering bringing the tax in, I was speaking on panels and I was speaking on the radio and whatever else, having these debates with people and said, oh, but Eton will be able to afford this. Of course Eton will be able to afford it. They've got a ginormous charitable foundation behind them. What worried me at the time and worries me now, and we've seen with the closures, are the small schools that, don't get the limelight for the brilliant work they do in communities that have taken the brunt and closed down. So again, it's misguided politics and partisanship and ideology which have driven this. And I think that is the overriding lesson to be learned, that, if you're going to do policy, you do need to think about everything, not just from your own political perspective, because the damage that this tax has done is entirely the fault of misguided ideologues.
Julie, how do you see the politics of VAT on fees? Are you pleased that it has become such a political hot potato, or does that sometimes make things harder for you and your members?
No, not pleased. Education's become increasingly politicised. I don't think it's helpful, because I think policy that affects children is so important. That kind of policy area should be driven by evidence and not ideology. And as Maxwell rightly points out, the evidence shows us that most independent schools are small schools. Most independent school parents are not finding it easy to afford the fees. So that's why we're already seeing the human cost of this policy on the pupils, on the families, and on the staff. If there is going to be a policy focus, I'd rather that focus was on all children, all schools, how we can work together to spread educational opportunity and not get bogged down in trying to play off one type of school or one aspect against another. Parents should have plenty of choice in the schooling they can find for their children. Children need a whole range of things. I mean, this country does have an amazing array of specialism across its schools as a whole, and we should just be making the most of that so that we can work together more, so more partnerships and more positive policy for the 100% of children in schools.
Okay, we are nearly at the end of this episode, so it's time for my last question. I doubt that the very public debate over VAT on school fees is going away anytime soon. I've been writing about it since 2023, and there's now even more data and evidence emerging as this policy has begun to take effect. Since the Labour election manifesto in 2024, we've had almost exactly 2 years now of supporters and critics of this policy battling it out. So my question is, what do you think the next 2 years holds for the debate over VAT on independent school fees? Julie, what do you think we will see over the next 2 years regarding VAT on fees?
It will be really interesting to see what comes through in manifestos ahead of the next general election. I think we will increasingly see an appreciation of the true nature of the independent sector, which is lots and lots of schools of various kinds, which do a great job for children. There has been, because of this focus on our sector, unwelcome as it was, there has been a growth in understanding that our sector is a whole lot more accessible than perhaps people realised, and has a lot to offer the country. And I think also we'll see rising awareness of the effects of the VAT policy and the business rates policy. So what I'd hope that will lead to is a revision of the assessment of the net fiscal impact so that we can have a review and look again and pivot towards more positive policies that support all children.
Thank you, Julie. Maxwell, I don't know if you're planning to place any more bets anytime soon, but what is your verdict on what the next couple of years will hold for this debate?
I think my betting days are over, Tom. But no, look, I think it's going to be a case of when more data and more evidence comes out, we'll have that review, I think, at the end of this parliamentary session. I think either Julie's organisation may undertake more research or, DFE may be pressured into it. We'll see. I think it's also worth highlighting the human stories behind this as well, because a lot of this has been, and the bet was about numbers at the end of the day. But as Julie's right to highlight, this is fundamentally about children and their future. And I think it's going to be important to highlight those stories of parents who do scrimp and save and don't go on holidays and don't buy a new car in order to send their kids to schools which have gotten more expensive because of government policy. The other thing I think that's going to come into the fore, and this is some work we're doing at the Adam Smith Institute at the moment, is on school vouchers and looking at a new way of funding education and trying to think about fundamentally giving parents more choice, because I think that's the word that's been left out of this debate fundamentally, is the empowerment of parents, the empowerment of choice, the empowerment of children. And I found it really fascinating watching government policy over the past 10 years mainly revolve around how we treat children. Under 16 social media ban, new regulations on food, the generational smoking ban, toothbrushing clubs, free breakfast clubs. It's revolving a lot around kids and children, even moving the voting age down to 16. So the question I've really got for policymakers is, why aren't we rethinking the education system to work for children? And in my opinion, and looking at the evidence, especially from America, where we've seen fantastic successes in state schools and funding for state schools and competition between state schools because of a voucher system. So whilst we deal on one side with this, with this tax, and we work out what the damage that's been done and what remediation we can do in the short term, I think it's now time for people who are really excited about education, the power of education and the power of choice, to come together and start thinking about vouchers for schooling and giving true choice to parents who I think deserve it after what has been quite a rough 16, 17 years with the economy and where the economy's been heading.
Thank you, Maxwell. And that brings us to the end of this episode. My thanks to Julie and Maxwell for giving their perspective on what has been and may well continue to be one of the most high-profile debates in our education system. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do share it with others and leave a good rating wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you join me when I next go inside your ed. Bye-bye for now.